Chapter 15. The Third Ashanti War, 1813 to 1816. On the death of Atta in 1811, his brother Kwaku Ashanti succeeded him to the stool of Akim. He soon incurred the displeasure of his chiefs by his apathy and failure to carry out the patriotic schemes of his predecessor, and they therefore plotted against him and finally resolved to depose him and put him to death. But being unwilling to have his blood on their hands, compromised matters by ordering him to commit suicide. After an interval of a week, which he spent in making a great custom for his own funeral, he took his life and was succeeded by Kujo Kuma. The new king was of a much more warlike disposition, and during the next 2 years he kept his people continually under arms in readiness for another attack by the Ashantis, and finally, when they made no move, joined Kwao Safachi in Akwapim in making a combined attack on the Akras, against whom, as allies of Ashanti, they entertained the bitterest animosity. But although the Akras had been greatly weakened by an epidemic of smallpox that had broken out a year or two before, they succeeded in driving off their enemies after a severe struggle. Since their last unsuccessful invasion in 1811, the Ashantis had made no attempt to revenge themselves on the rebels, but in 1814 the king determined once and for all to crush Akim and Akwapim, which had now been in open revolt for as long as 3 years. The roads to the coast had, of course, been closed during the whole of this time, and the Ashantis had consequently suffered much loss and inconvenience from the stoppage of their trade and the difficulty in obtaining powder, salt, and other necessaries from the seaboard towns. A large army of 20,000 men was at once raised and placed under the command of Amankwa Abinowa, who received orders to advance into Akim, while a smaller force under Apia Dunkwa was sent in the direction of Winneba to cut off Kujo Kuma if he should attempt to repeat the tactics of Atta and fly to Fanti. It was expected that on the approach of such an overwhelming force, and with their previous means of escape cut off, the Akims would immediately sue for peace, in which case Amankwa was instructed to receive their submission and exact a fine and then return to Kumasi. These expectations, however, were never realized, though the Akims retreated before the invaders to within a day's march of Akwapim. Here, Kujokuma succeeded in cutting off a foraging party of the enemy, killing 7 of them, and the next day a general engagement took place at Egwa Aru. After a battle lasting 6 hours, the Ashantis routed the allies and gained a victory, which Amankwa announced by sending a jawbone and a slave to each of the Accra towns. He soon afterwards followed with his army to receive the tribute, now overdue, and the payments on the notes for the forts, which, owing to the recent disturbances and the closure of the paths, the Ashantis had been unable to collect before. The Ashantis remained in this district for nearly 12 months, causing great discontent amongst the Akras, who found that their long and faithful allegiance and the many services that they had rendered in the past could avail them nothing now in preventing extortion and privations from the scarcity of provisions. After this long delay, finding there was no likelihood of the submission of the enemy, Amankwa returned to Akwapim, where he received a present of gold and a message from the king, forbidding him to return to the capital unless he brought the heads of Kwao Safachi and Kujokuma with him. He therefore returned at once to Accra, where he deposited the baggage of his army and took a fetish oath with all his captains to carry out the orders of their king. Meanwhile, Apia Dunkwa's advance had been opposed by the Fantis, whom he defeated on several occasions towards the end of 1815. In an action near Ajumako, the people of that place and the Winnebars were routed with great loss in killed and prisoners. Winneba, which had been rebuilt since 1812, Beraku, and several other towns were plundered and burned. During the operations in Asin, Apia Dunkwa had died and been succeeded in the command by his brother, Apia Nanu, with Baki as second. This general, however, was not sufficiently energetic to satisfy Tutu Kwamina, who, on learning of his indolence and inactivity, sent orders to Amankwa to amalgamate the two armies and take over the supreme command. The junction was effected at Esikuma in February 1816, and the combined force then moved through Ajumako and marched on Abra, where the Fantis had assembled in great numbers to give them battle. But on the approach of the Ashantis, their valor quickly evaporated, and they fled before the enemy arrived, leaving them to encamp on the ground they had so hurriedly vacated. The beach to leeward of Anamabo was now crowded with fugitives, and numbers of men, women, and children came flocking in to seek the protection of the forts. On the 12th of March, 1816, the governor sent 2 soldiers with a Union Jack and a flag of truce to ask Amankwa why he was approaching so near to Cape Coast, and on the 13th, the greatest alarm was caused by the arrival of a strong body of Ashantis at the back of Maury. The Mauries, together with the inhabitants of the other leeward villages and crowds of people from the bush, poured into Cape Coast in a continuous stream, and about 5,000 women and children were admitted to the castle. Many of the fugitives slept in canoes anchored at a little distance from the shore, but others, wishing to put as many miles as possible between themselves and the Ashantis, would not even stay in Cape Coast, but continued their headlong flight to westward. On the 14th, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the panic of the preceding day was still further increased by the sudden appearance of a detachment of the enemy on the outskirts of Cape Coast itself. About 100 Assassins under Kwesi Amankwa were seen near the lagoon on the western side of the town, but they seemed to have come only for plunder or to reconnoitre, and were easily driven off. On the 15th, the governor's messengers returned from the Ashanti camp with the following reply from Amankwa: that he was determined to pursue Kawao Safachi, Kujokuma, and Kofi Ashanti to whatever place they might retreat. In fact, that should they throw themselves into the sea, bury themselves in the earth, or secrete themselves in a rock, he would follow them. They also reported that 6 Ashanti messengers were then waiting outside the town with a message for the governor. These men were escorted into Cape Coast and provided with lodgings in the town, where they were seen by 2 of the officers from the castle, Misters James and Mollen, and for the Fantis were too ashamed to let them be admitted to an audience in the castle, the usual course, because they would have seen the crowds of women and children who had taken refuge there. They were promised that if it lay in the governor's power to seize Kawao Safachi or Kujokuma, he would do so in order to restore the peace, and would instruct the commandant of Anamabo Fort to make the people of that place take fetish to the same effect, as those of Cape Coast had already done. The messengers then returned to their camp, escorted by 2 soldiers bearing the company's flag and a flag of truce, and a present from the governor to Amankwa. On the 21st they returned, and as the Dutch governor, General Daendels, had expressed a wish that one of his officers might be present to cooperate with the English in any negotiations for peace. A message was sent to Elmina to notify him of their arrival. On the 28th, two Dutch officers, Misters Van Neck and Huidecooper, came over, and most of the women and children having first been sent out of the castle, the Ashanti messengers were received in the Palaver Hall. After conveying their general's thanks for the presents that had been sent him by the governor, they explained that he had received strict orders from the king not to molest any of the people living under the protection of the European forts, but having sworn that he would pursue Kwao Savachi, Kujokuma, and Kofi Ashanti to whatever place they might retreat, he had been compelled to come to Cape Coast in order to ascertain whether these men were in the town. He was now fully satisfied that they were not there, and only required that Kwao Agri, Paintree, and Amisa, three chiefs who had fought for them and assisted them to escape to leeward, should return with his messengers and help him in his search for them. These men, being in town, were sent for, and said they were quite ready to go with the messengers if they would first swear on the king's head that no harm should befall them. These messengers, however, explained that they could not give such a guarantee because they were not of high enough rank to do so without the consent of Amankwa, and it was therefore arranged that they should return and inform him of what had passed, while the three chiefs swore that they would not leave the town until his answer was received. A little later, however, the Fantis borrowed 100 ounces of gold from the governor, Mr. Hope Smith, which they paid to Amankwa in consideration of his agreeing to waive all claims on Agri, Paintree, and Amisa, and both parties then took a fetish oath to abstain from any further hostilities against each other. Peace having thus been restored between the Fantis and Ashantis, great numbers of the latter began to arrive in Cape Coast, and for a time trade was very brisk. The people, nevertheless, suffered severely from famine owing to their inability to visit their farms during the war and the consequent failure of the crops. So great was the distress at one time that Mr. Dawson and some other officers subscribed a considerable sum for its relief. Corn was purchased from other parts of the coast and distributed daily from the castle, and similar arrangements had to be made for the supply of the garrison. During this war, the Alminas had not forgotten their feud with the people of Cape Coast and the Fantis, and had, as on former occasions, ill-treated those who had fled to their town. They had also joined with the Wassaus and Assassins in threatening to attack Comenda, but the garrison of the fort was reinforced, and they gave up the idea. In June, the Ashantis broke up their camp and moved towards Accra in search of the proscribed chiefs. During their progress through the country, they inflicted great misery on the people by their seizures of provisions and other exactions. Near Inkum, Kujokuma was surrounded by a small party under Apiananu, and finding escape impossible, preferred to commit suicide rather than fall alive into the hands of his enemies. His head was cut off and smoke-dried to be sent to Kumasi. Soon afterwards, Kwao Savachi, whose people had now grown tired of him, was also killed. He had made good his escape to Akwapim and was living in hiding in the village of Amanprobi, but his brother Adu Dunkwa offered to betray him on condition that he was given the stool. Amankwa promptly agreed to these terms, and Adu Dunkwa led a party of the Ashantis to Amanprobi, which they surrounded, while he himself went to Kwao Savachi and advised him to commit suicide. Savachi, however, believed that he would soon succeed in wearing out the king's patience and be left in peace, and refused. Adudunkwa then turned to go, which was the signal for the waiting Ashantis to shoot the unfortunate chief down. He struggled to his feet 4 times, accusing his brother of being his murderer, but was finally killed and his body brought down to Accra. His head was then smoked and sent with that of Kujakuma to Kumasi. Kofi Ashanti was not considered of any real importance, and as he had some influence at the Ashanti court, was allowed to escape. Amankwa had thus achieved the object of the invasion by obtaining the heads of the 2 chief rebels and compelling Akim and Akwapim to return to their allegiance. He had also established the king's authority throughout Fanti, and now returned to Kumasi with the army, leaving Ashanti residents in the principal towns to preserve order and collect tribute. On the least suspicion of disloyalty, these men exacted heavy fines from the chiefs, and the Mori of Anamabo especially suffered in this respect. The Ashantis made some attempt to avenge their former defeat by the Krobos during the return march, but, as on the previous occasion, the inaccessible nature of their mountain strongholds enabled these people to hold their own, and the project was soon abandoned. It was at about this time that the first real efforts were made by the English to extend their jurisdiction and do something to improve the condition of the people. Hitherto they had seldom ventured to interfere with them, but now we find the governor sending to demand the release of some Cape Coast canoemen who had been panyard by the people of Legu, upon whom, after they had surrendered the men, a fine was inflicted and its payment enforced. In the proceedings of the council at Cape Coast on the 28th of January, 1815, too, it is recorded that a fine of 4 ounces of gold was imposed on the chiefs of Anamabo on account of some misconduct towards a trader there, and the governor banished from Cape Coast a native named Brew, who had been detected in intrigues with Ashanti for the continuance of the slave trade. Again, when on the death of one of the Cape Coast chiefs, one of the headmen was accused of witchcraft and sentenced to death by torture, he was rescued by the governor and sent for safety to Sierra Leone. Every effort was made, too, to check the cruel practice of offering human sacrifices at funeral and other customs. In 1816, a girl was sacrificed at Dick's Cove on the death of Kujo Tando, the chief, but Mr. Hutchison interfered in time to save the life of a man who was to have shared her fate. And in April 1817, at Commenda, 4 persons who were about to be sacrificed at a funeral custom were rescued by the acting commandant, Mr. Aitken, in spite of the violent resistance of the people. To such heights had British authority now grown that 10 ounces of gold was actually paid by the commenders as a fine, besides all the expenses that had been incurred. At the end of 1815, a school for the education of children was established at Cape Coast under a headmaster specially sent out from England, who was assisted by 3 or 4 educated mulattoes. And in March 1817, the governor reported that there were 40 boys in attendance and that this number was daily rising. There had been a native chaplain in Cape Coast for between 50 and 60 years. He had been educated at Oxford, but being now over 80 years of age and past all duty, he was relieved by an English chaplain sent out by the African Committee in 1816. The Abolition Act of 1807, though it declared the slave trade illegal, had by no means put an end to the traffic, and great numbers of slaves were still secretly smuggled off the coast, who endured quite as great hardships and sufferings as those who were taken when the trade was recognized. Then the slaves had usually been fairly well treated from interested motives, but though they were now of greater value than ever, owing to the increased difficulty and risk in obtaining them. They were often half-starved and the ships horribly overcrowded in order that the greatest possible profit might be made on the voyage, while smallpox or measles not infrequently broke out with the most terrible results. Yet, though the losses from disease on individual ships were at times appalling, the average mortality in the whole trade was less after the act was passed than it had ever been before. Formerly, it was stated to have been about 14%, but this was now reduced to 9%, though when dysentery or some other disease broke out, the proportion of deaths among individual cargoes would often be as high as 35 or even 50%. While partly due to the increased care of the slaves owing to their enhanced value, this diminution in the death rate was mainly attributable to other causes. In the old days, the slave ships were nearly all slow vessels, and lay off the coast for several months while they were collecting their full cargo. During the whole of this time, the slaves that were first purchased were kept closely confined in the vessel's hold, where they were stowed in tiers, one above the other, and anything approaching a satisfactory degree of ventilation was hopelessly unattainable. When the trade was declared illegal, on the other hand, faster ships had to be employed to escape the cruisers, and as the models that were best adapted for fast sailing only admitted of one tier of slaves, the air in the holds was very much purer than it had previously been. At the same time, the length of the voyage was shortened, and all the slaves were taken on board as soon as the ship arrived on the coast, and she left again at once. The loss due to the long confinement of some of the slaves in the vessel's hold was thus obviated, for they were kept in barracoons on shore and under more or less natural conditions, and there held in readiness for shipment in bulk whenever a slaver put in. The commissioners sent out by His Majesty's government to investigate the condition of the settlements and forts on the west coast of Africa in 1811 reported that the slave trade was still being carried on to a vast extent. Before the passing of the Abolition Act, this trade had been principally in the hands of the English, and as America had also passed some stringent laws to the same effect, it had been hoped in both countries that the traffic had received a mortal blow. For the first few months, a cessation of the trade did indeed take place, and though slaves were still brought down to the coast, yet, when it was found that they could not be disposed of, they were either taken back again, or retailed locally as domestic slaves, and before long they ceased to arrive altogether. But the great advantages to be derived from occupying the opening thus left on the coast of Africa by the retreat of the English were soon perceived by the Americans, particularly those of the southern states, who, setting the laws of their country at defiance, boldly engaged to an immense extent in this trade, covering their vessels by a fictitious sale at the Havana, Tenerife, or any of the other Spanish colonies, where they were easily furnished with false papers. But the Americans were not the only culprits. Many English ships also sailed in this way under the Spanish flag, and by the autumn of 1809 the whole coast swarmed with such vessels. Nor were the people themselves less willing than the Americans, Spaniards, and others to profit by the renewal of the trade. The King of Ashanti, in consideration of some concessions he made a few years later, specially asked that the trade might be re-established, and the Governor and Council of Cape Coast reported to the African Committee in March 1817 that it must seriously be impressed that this traffic is the only object of commerce congenial to the natives, or to which they are actively disposed. They will cling to it to the very last moment. They may be deprived of it, but they cannot be diverted from it. They will quit it, but from necessity, and make opportunities rather than neglect them. The people of the coast are the brokers of those of the interior, who supply the slaves, and as they are established from necessity as the sole medium between the vessels and the sellers, they have every facility of adding to their regular profit by impositions which can neither be noticed by one party nor detected by the other. This trade is consequently, beyond all comparison, so indolent and lucrative that even if there were any appeal to their feelings, it would not influence in competition with such inordinate gain. Every other trade requires, comparatively, activity and exertion, and yields very inferior profit. It is unreasonable, therefore, to expect any conduct on the part of the natives but such as may be auxiliary to the slave traders. It is not surprising, therefore, that in the face of so much opposition and so many difficulties, that the British cruisers made but a small impression upon this trade. The slave ships were fast and were seldom overtaken, and there was at first considerable doubt as to the legality of interference with ships nominally of Spanish nationality. The effect of this revival of the slave trade was soon visible on the Gold Coast in the increased numbers of crimes of violence and a renewal of panyaring and other practices that had been almost unheard of for some years. The effect of the act on legitimate trade was very noticeable, and though now that the attention of the people had been diverted to general commerce, the exports of other produce from the coast showed a steady increase, yet the imports of European goods were markedly less on account of the lower value of the whole of this new trade as compared with that of the slaves for which these goods had formerly been bartered. The means by which the people had once made great profits was now closed to them, and their purchasing power had suffered. This is clearly shown by the following figures, which are not, however, confined to the Gold Coast alone, but include the other British settlements on the west coast of Africa. In the year 1805, exports were valued at £193,034, and imports were valued at £1,156,555. Meanwhile, by 1810, 5 years later, exports had risen to £535,577, whereas imports were at £693,911. In connection with the above table, it was estimated that the total value of cargoes sent from Africa to England was at least a fifth or sixth more, for the slavers often combined piracy with their other businesses, and many vessels were lost or captured on the voyage home. A great deal of the slave trade that now existed was carried on from places on the slave coast. At Ouida especially, the people had rehoisted the flags on the abandoned English and other forts as an intimation to passing slavers that they could be supplied there, and the forts themselves were used as barracoons. Slavers trading to these ports had to obtain canoes on the Gold Coast, and these were actually supplied by Governor White for a long time, until Commodore Irby ordered him to stop the practice. The Dutch were even less particular and openly abetted the slavers by furnishing their ships with water and canoes at Elmina, and selling them goods suitable for the trade. In December 1810, a schooner flying Spanish colours was seen lying off Elmina by HMS Nemesis, and Captain Ferris ordered an officer to board her and examine her papers. Both the castle and Fort Conradsburg opened fire on the man-of-war's boat, and one of her crew was wounded by a volley of musketry from the schooner. The boat, therefore, put back to the ship, and Captain Ferris came to an anchor within range of the castle and sent his first lieutenant ashore to demand a perusal of the schooner's papers, and the attendance of her captain on board his ship to answer for his conduct. The papers were produced, but the Dutch governor represented that as the schooner was under the protection of the guns of his fort, he could not very well hand over her captain. That night, however, two of the man-of-war's boats cut her out under the cover of darkness and took her to Cape Coast, where her captain was cautioned to be more respectful to His Majesty's ships in the future and then discharged. In 1817, too, though the Dutch government had issued strict orders for the prevention of the slave trade, Governor Daendels was still regularly supplying the Portuguese and Spanish slavers with canoes, water, and goods, and in February of that year, a large Spanish ship lay off Elmina Castle for 4 days and sailed down to Appam, where the Dutch Fort Leidenside stood, and shipped 400 slaves. In the absence of the men of war, it must be admitted that the forts made very little effort to interfere with vessels taking slaves on board, even in their immediate neighborhood. In March 1810, the Anna, a Spanish brig from Havana, took a cargo of slaves on board at Cape Coast, with no other interruption from the castle than a threat to fire on her. These slaves were supplied by a mulatto named Howell, who lived within a quarter of a mile of the castle and consequently under its protection. He was a considerable trader in the town, the son of a European officer in the company's service, and had been educated in England. This brig was captured in May by HMS Crocodile. This, however, was no isolated instance of such open defiance of the forts, for according to Cruikshank, there were not fewer than 7 large ships in February 1818, all taking slaves on board, close to Cape Coast Castle. It was probably at about this time that Winnebah Fort was rebuilt, for in the minutes of a meeting of the Committee of the Company of Merchants in London, held on the 19th of May, 1815, the following passage occurs: "The committee understanding from the information of gentlemen who have received late advices from that part of the coast, that the natives are very desirous that the fort should be rebuilt, and continuing impressed with a sense of the importance of the possession, as well as for the reasons above stated, as from the consideration that the station, if abandoned by this country, may be taken possession of by some other power, resolved unanimously that the governor and council be directed to demand from the natives a sum of money in satisfaction of the injury done to the late Mr. Meredith, and if the same shall be recovered and sufficient security can be obtained for the safety of the persons to be employed in rebuilding the fort, that the work be proceeded in, provided it shall appear on an inspection by the surveyor that it can be accomplished within a reasonable time, and at an expense not exceeding £1,500 currency, including such articles as it may be necessary to send from this country, and which the committee imagine would not exceed £300 currency."